Okay, so today we're going to be going over Linux services. Um, what is a service? Service is essentially an application or a suite of applications that carry out tasks to try to automate some process in the background. Some common services that you'll generally want to have a thorough knowledge of for Cyber Patriot are SSH, VS-FTPD, Pro-FTPD, Samba, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Um, for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to be going over the first three, which are SSH, VS-FTPD, and Pro-FTPD. And on Linux, you manage services with the service command. There's also the systemctl command, but that is generally regarded as deprecated, so you should use the service command. And the usage is pretty straightforward. You just write service and then the name of the service, and then start, stop, restart, or status, and those are all pretty self-explanatory. Some general rules about services. And these are I don't have it on the slide, but this is specific to Cyber Patriot. So for the competition, when you're configuring services, you will want to disable any and all services that aren't mentioned in the README. So this sounds pretty extreme, but the way Cyber Patriot competitions are that in the README you'll typically have you'll typically have one or two services for each image, and you'll be asked to like maintain the security of the service and keep it running and everything. So if you find a service that isn't mentioned in the README, then you should disable it. And also you can go the added step further and delete its package, but generally disabling it will be okay. But there are exceptions to this, of course. There are a number of default services on vanilla Linux machines that you will want to keep because they execute some important background processes, such as Avahi and dhclient and DNSMask. So you'll want to keep these and a few others, but for the large majority, if you see a service that isn't mentioned in the README, then you should disable it. Um, Also, this goes for something like FTP. Even though I'm going to be showing you all how to secure FTP, if the README doesn't mention FTP, then you should definitely disable and remove it if you find it. Same goes for SSH and everything else. So that is a general rule of thumb. Also, what you will want to do is, oh, sorry. Also, if you recognize or you see a service that you don't recognize, and you aren't sure whether you should like remove it or not, and it isn't one of these three or any of these or any that I'm going to go over, then what you should do before competitions preferably is have a vanilla Linux machine installed, and then you'll be able to list all of the services on that machine with this service status all command. And so if on the Cyber Patriot image you have a service that isn't within this list of default services, then typically you should stop that service. Okay, the next rule, don't reinstall or remove services that are in the README. So this might sound pretty obvious, but what happens somewhat frequently is that teams will not know how to configure something correctly, so they might just wipe the service completely by reinstalling it. And while this can be good in some cases, sometimes in the README there might be pre-existing configurations that you will not want to get rid of by reinstalling. So for example, with Samba, you might have some shares on the computer, and reinstalling the service will get rid of all those shares. So be very careful before you plan to reinstall or remove one of the required services, and make sure you thoroughly check the README to ensure that you're not like going to remove anything. And the final rule of thumb is to restart services after you configure them. Um, there are some services that are exceptions to this. I can't really think of any off the top of my head, but for the majority of them, or yeah, like LightDM, for example, or no, not LightDM, sorry. But there are services that you don't need to restart to save their changes. Like PAM, for example, you can modify the pluggable authentication modules, and restarting won't accomplish anything. So there's some services or packages that will save their changes automatically, but for the vast majority of them, you should restart the service after you configure them in order for your changes to save. And in order to do that, you use the sudo service and then the name of the service restart command. Okay, so the first service we're going to be going over is OpenSSH. You're probably familiar with SSH, but if you aren't, it's just it stands for Secure Shell, and it enables remote connections from a client to a server for things such as logins to various users and also for file transfers, but primarily for logins. So if you want to log into like a user on a different machine, you will likely use SSH. The syntax for the SSH command is SSH and then the username of the user that you want to log into on the host, or yeah, and then the IP address of the machine that you want to log into. So that's the general syntax. And then there are two main forms of authentication for OpenSSH. You'll have password-based authentication, which is just when you use this command, it will ask you for what the password of this user is. So that's pretty straightforward. And then there's also public key authentication. I'm not going to go very far into depth on public key authentication because it's not super important to configure it for the purposes of this competition. But essentially, with public key authentication, you'll have a public key on the server that you want to connect to, and then on your host computer, you'll have a private key which only you have and should be relatively secretive. And then connecting to the server will see if the public and private keys match. And if they do, then you can log into the user without having any password or without using any password. So public key authentication is generally regarded as safer than private key. Um, but once again, you don't really need to know much about it. These are just the two main forms of authentication. What you do need to know though is that public keys are stored in this directory. The tilde, if you don't remember from a previous meeting, which I think I went over, the tilde just represents the home directory of the user that you currently are. So I could replace this with home/radius if my username was radius. But tilde is like a wildcard kind of, it just refers to the home directory of any user. Well, not any user, but the user that is currently logged in. So, for example, if I wanted to log into uh, Radius's account from a different computer using SSH, and I wanted to use a public key, then I would have my public key stored in home/radius/.ssh, and then this file, which is authorized keys. Um, Same thing if I wanted to log into someone named like Balin, then I would need my public key within Balin's home directory and then .ssh folder and then in his authorized keys file. So that's where public keys are stored if you intend on using public key authentication. And as I mentioned earlier, your private key stays on the computer that you are connecting from. So configuring OpenSSH, or sorry, actually I'm gonna go over quickly like how you would use SSH, just because. Let me change my screen. Okay, so I believe you all can see that. Okay, um, so as you can see, this is my host computer. I'm in a VM right now. I can write the whoami command to get my username, but it's also at the very left right here. So I'm currently logged in as Radius on my Ubuntu image. But if I wanted to SSH to a different server, for example, TJ's remote access server, and by the way, all of you guys can do this. Um, you can just SSH with your Ion username or your CSL username, and then the IP. Oh shoot, that's not it. Sorry. I have it right here. So this is the IP address to TJ's remote access server. So you can SSH with your username and then the @ symbol and then the IP address. And as you can see, you get this welcome banner, which shows that you're connecting to the correct IP address. And then you can type in your Ion password. I just made a typo. And now you can see I'm logged in. And when I write the whoami command again, I'm logged into my Ion username. So I'm essentially on a different computer right now. Is it sensitive? Okay, no, yeah. So I just have my some various files that I have on my remote access server. And all of you guys can do this. You just need to have the IP address for the remote access server. I don't exactly remember what the domain is, but this is the IP address. Uh, so so that's like basic usage of SSH. And then if you want to get out of the connection that you'd made, then you just do exit. And you can see connection closed. So now I'm back on Radius. Okay, and let me go back to my slides. Hold on, give me a second, sorry. Oh, there we go. I don't know why that took so long. I couldn't find the screen. Okay, sorry about that. So for configuring SSH, the first thing you'll want to do is install the SSH package. And with this package, you get the both OpenSSH server package and the OpenSSH client package. You'll only really need OpenSSH server because uh, well, as a general rule, when you're configuring services for Cyber Patriot, you are configuring the server side aspect of it. So you want people to be able to connect to that computer. You're not connecting to other computers with your own. So you're downloading the OpenSSH server and OpenSSH client packages with this command. Um, and then after that, you want to allow SSH connections from the firewall. So remember, as I said, you're like managing the server side aspect of SSH. So you want to allow connections that are inbound, trying to connect to your SSH server. Um, and if you remember, without like inputting in or out, then UFW allow 22 by default accepts inbound connections. So this will allow inbound connections on port 22, which also, if you remember, corresponds to the default SSH port. Um, and then an alternative is to enable SSH from the firewall using IP tables with this command. So you add it to the input chain, and then the protocol is TCP on port 22, and you'll want to accept the connection. So you can use either of these. These are interchangeable pretty much. And that's how you enable or allow SSH connections from your firewall. And then the rest of your configuration for SSH will be in this folder, etc ssh sshd underscore config. So I'm only gonna go over three of these wait, sorry. Yeah, so I'm only gonna go over these three specific configurations, but what I encourage you all to do um is not to limit yourself to like the stuff that I'm talking about during this presentation. I'm going to try to go like somewhat comprehensively throughout all of these services, but typically what I'll find what happens with teams like and even someone asked me earlier like a couple weeks ago when you're running into like a roadblock or you like can't figure out why you're not getting points not during the round but like after the round or you see that like oh, you're not really getting any better. It doesn't look like you're finding any more vulnerabilities than like you would in previous rounds or something. Oftentimes the problem will be that you are lacking in configuration. There is like a lot of potential to gain points from configuration. I'm speaking from my experience, like competing on Linux images. Like there are tons of different like files that you can edit to add configuration. I've already went over a bunch of them, like sysctl, and now you have these services that Cyber Patriot might ask you to maintain. So you'll have files like sysctl, and then here you'll have the config files for services that you want to maintain. And there are a bunch of points that you can get from like doing more research into like security hardening for these services and getting points from modifying the configuration like more than just the stuff that I'm showing you right now. So these three lines are pretty important. If one of them is like yes or something or it's configured badly, you'll typically get points for it. So the first one is permit root login. You want that to be no because you do not want anyone to be able to SSH into your root user. That's a security vulnerability. And then also you have permit empty passwords. You don't want anyone to be able to SSH with an empty password. And then you'll have password authentication. By or Generally, you want this to be yes. However, if you remember, the other form of authentication is with public keys. So if the README says that it wants SSH to have public key authentication, then you want this to be no. But generally, you'll have it be yes. And then the final thing that you want to do for configuring SSH is to remove all the public keys. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, public keys are stored in the home directory and then the hidden folder .ssh and then in the file authorized keys. Um, it might also be in like some kind of other like file name like ars_id.pub or something. I'm not exactly sure, but so this is where public keys are stored. And the reason you'll want to remove public keys is because if the README doesn't specify that you want public key authentication, and there are public keys in some random admin users folder, then that means that there is a connection who you don't know is coming from, which will be able to SSH into that user with no password, which is definitely a vulnerability. So you'll want to remove any public keys that you find. And remember also that this authorized keys file is in the home directory, but this tilde refers to any home directory, so it could be any user. But you'll generally want to like look through all of the admin users because those are the most like those are the ones you want to secure the most. So you can if there's an admin named Balin, then you want to look through Balin like that and such. So okay, I'll show you guys how you can configure it like hands-on. So let me share my screen again. Okay, so like I said, first you'll want to install the SSH package if you don't already have it with the apt-get command. Okay, so now that's done, you can enable, I don't think my firewall is enabled first of all, but so you can enable the firewall and then allow port 22, which is SSH. You can also do UFW allow SSH, and that will do the same thing. As you can see, it says skipping adding existing rule. But either of these work. You can also use IP tables. And then as for the file that you're configuring, it's in at etc sshd_config. Remember the three configuration lines that I went through in the slides are permit root login. So you have this here. Like you'll just want to change this to no, and then permit empty password. Oh, by the way, this thing that I'm doing right here with the slash at the bottom, this is like well, Rafu went over a bit of Vim last meeting or last block, but you can like essentially control F for stuff in a file with the slash in Vim, and then you just type in like something like uh, sponse, and then they'll pull up response, and then when you press N, it will iterate to the next like match, and then capital N goes backwards. So that's what I'm using to find uh, these lines in the configuration. So the next one is permit empty passwords. This one is already no, which is good, so you won't need to change that. And the last one is password authentication. This one is commented out, so you'll want to uncomment it and then make it yes. And then after that, you can save the file. :wq in Vim is for save and exit. And now what we want to do is look for any public keys. So I can just go to cd/home/rated/.sh. And here it looks like we don't have any authorized keys, but you can also remove these id_rsa and id_rsa.pub. But the authorized keys file won't point to these because, so I'm going to go back to this file really quickly. Um, so you can see here, this is the authorized keys file. If this is uncommented, then it will point to, uh, wait, can you guys see that? Okay, sorry, I was getting a notification. I didn't mean to interrupt. Let me exit out of this. So the authorized keys file in the SSH file, it points to like the file that I mentioned earlier, ssh/authorized_keys. So if this is uncommented, then any other like if there was a file here named auth keys or something, it wouldn't even matter what was in there because the authorized keys like file doesn't exist. Um, if however, um, if however it was pointing to auth keys right here, then you would want to check out the auth keys file because that means there are public keys that are pointing to the auth keys file. But in this scenario, there's no security vulnerability here. You can still delete these. So by the way, these are actually um, This is for if you want to generate an SSH key on your host machine. So if you see these, it's not like a security vulnerability or anything. This is just some testing stuff that I was doing earlier. So there's nothing here. So now you can just restart the service, and you should get any points if there are any for SSH, which typically there are if it is mentioned in the README. Okay, next thing we're going to go over is file transfer protocol, or FTP. So file transfer protocol is for transferring files between a client and a server machine. Um, Inherently, FTP is an insecure protocol, so you want to have various other servers. The two primary ones are VSFTPD and ProFTPD on the server side. And then on the client side, so if you, for example, want to connect using FTP to some random like file server, then you will need an FTP client. And like the most common type of client is FileZilla. So uh, the difference between FileZilla and these two are that VSFTPD and ProFTPD are on the server side, meanwhile FileZilla is on the client side. So you will only need to concern yourself with the VSFTP and ProFTPD, sorry, because as I mentioned earlier, Cyber Patriot will only have you configuring the server side of the service. Um, and the dynamic between the client and server for FTP and pretty much every service is that the client accesses the server's file system. So you don't connect to another an FTP. You don't connect to the client from the server. You connect from the sorry. You don't connect to the client from the server. You connect to the server from the client. And in this case, you are managing the server. So sorry if that's confusing. um, but in order to configure VSFTPD, which by the way stands for Very Secure FTPD, which is kind of ironic because you still need to secure it, you'll first install the package as you would like any other service if it's not already there. Then you want to allow it from the firewall. So FTP listens on ports 20 and 21, so you want to allow both of these. I have this notation here where it's in parentheses separated by a colon. This isn't an actual like syntax thing in UFW, so I just didn't want to write on two lines, but you you will need to do like 20 and then run another command that's 21 for each of these, by the way. But you can use either UFW or IP tables again. And then the VSFTPD configuration file is located here. There are three primary lines that you'll want to make sure are set correctly. Once again, though, there could be a lot more configuration, so I really encourage you all to do your own research about this. Um, but the three primary ones that are also often scored are anonymous underscore enable equals no, which disables anonymous access to the FTP server, local underscore enable equals yes, which enables access to local users, and then change root or chroot local user equals yes, which only allows users to access the home directory. Um, so I'll go through this also. As I'm sharing this though, one thing that I want you guys to think about is that oftentimes, even if you aren't completely sure about a service that they ask you to configure, or there is a service that is like new this year or something, there are a lot of like common aspects that secure services should all have in common. For example, I just went over a few of them with VSFTPD uh, and SSH. Like most of the time, almost 99% of the time, having a blank password when you connect to something is insecure. Same thing goes for connecting as root or something. And then also, this concept of anonymous access to file servers, that is another insecure, that's another kind of vulnerability that you want to look out for. So like universally, most services, if there's an option that will configure anonymous access, you'll want to disable it. Same thing goes for the other stuff I mentioned, like blank passwords. Um, so as I mentioned, the file is in vsftpd.conf in the etc directory. Oh, sorry, I didn't install it. So you just run the apt-get install vsftpd command. And then you can edit the etc vsftpd file. So as I mentioned, the three lines you want to look out for are anonymous enable equals no. So this is correctly configured, so I don't need to change it. And then local underscore enable This one is yes. So this is also correctly configured, and then change your underscore local underscore user. This one is commented out, so you'll want to uncomment it and then set it to yes, which is what it is already is. So that's all the configuration you need to do by the scope of this presentation, and then you can save the file and exit. Okay. Um, there also is more configuration that you'll want to do for VSFTPD, and that is along the lines of an SSL certificate. So an SSL, or secure socket layer, is what SSL stands for, is just an added layer of protection that FTP servers typically have, or they should have. So in order to gain an SSL certificate, you'll need to install the OpenSSL package. And then you can run this very long command, which I highly suggest you write down or screenshot or just put somewhere so that you don't have to like think of it off the top of your head. And this long, very long command will generate two files that pertain to your SSL certificate. You'll have, well, actually, in this case, there's only one file, so it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But typically, what you should have is you should have a file for where you like store the key for the SSL certificate, and then you'll have a file where the actual certificate is. But in this case, you're storing them in the same file. In other services, you might store them in different files. It's pretty arbitrary. Okay, so after you generate these two files, then you'll want to edit the vsftpd.conf file once again and point the files that you generated to these two arguments, the RSA cert underscore file and RSA private key underscore file. But in this case, as I mentioned, both the certificate and the key are being outputted to the same file, so these are exactly the same, but you still need to have it pointing to the correct file. And then lastly, change SSL underscore enable to yes. So let me go through that with you guys. Okay, so as I mentioned, you'll first need to install the OpenSSL package. I already have it installed, which is good. And then you copy that long command into your terminal. And here's what will happen is it's trying to generate an RSA key, and it uses some like information in order to process your request. For Cyber Patriot though, you can just have them all like blank, so just press enter through all of them and it will be completely fine. And it doesn't give you any feedback, but what it did just do is it outputted those two, or the one SSL certificate file to the um, etcssl slash private slash vsftpd.pem file. So as you can see, it's right here now. So now what you want to do is edit the vsftpd.conf file, change RSA underscore cert underscore file, change this. So this is obviously wrong because it doesn't point to the correct file. So the directory that I just typed is the same directory that I inputted in the command that I copy and pasted, and the same file that was generated from said command. And I'm gonna have the same argument for this field as well. And then finally, I'm gonna change SSL enable equal yes, and then save and exit. And now you can finally run sudo service vsftpd.restart, and that will save all your changes. Okay, next we're going to go over ProFTPD, and this is the last service we're going to cover for today. So ProFTPD, you'll find that it's very similar to VSFTPD because they're both FTP servers, but there are some differences. You'll want to install and allow it from the firewall almost exactly the same as you would with VSFTPD. It's on the same ports 21 and 20, but the package is named differently, obviously. And then also the configuration file is located in a different place. It's in etc proftpd slash proftpd.conf. And the four lines of configuration I'm going to show you guys are auth pam on, allow overwrite off, default root is this tilde, and then use IPv6 is off. As I mentioned though, I highly encourage you all to do research for yourselves and try to find as many security hardening guides or just compile like every security hardening guide you find, and then like get your own configuration for each of these services that encapsulates beyond the stuff that I'm showing you. But these are primarily stuff that tends to be scored, at least from my experience. So auth-pam just allows it to use the pluggable authentication modules. Allow overwrite makes it so that users cannot overwrite files when you set it to off. And the default root makes it so that the root directory for any user that connects through FTP is the /home file, or the /home directory, which is shortened by this tilde. And then use IPv6 just disables the use of IPv6. Another like common thing you'll see in services when you're configuring them is that IPv6 is generally not preferred. So you'll want to disable it whenever you see fit. And then the next thing that you want to do when you configure ProFTPD is remove all anonymous blocks. So as I mentioned, anonymous access tends to be a vulnerability. So in ProFTPD, different group like rules are delimited by these blocks. So you want to get rid of anything within this anonymous block because you want to disable anonymous access. And the next thing, or the final thing that you want to do is configure transport layer security, which is TLS. TLS and SSL are essentially the same. TLS is, or SSL is supposed to be like deprecated though, but essentially they're the same things. You do pretty much the same process. You install OpenSSL first, and then you run this long command, which is almost the exact same command, except um, the key out argument goes to this file ending in .key, and then the certificate ends in .crt. So these are different files that it outputs to. But like otherwise the command is pretty much the same. As you can imagine, it just outputs the certificate to two different files. And then in order to like synchronize the certificate that you just generated with TLS from ProFTPD, then you edit the etc ProFTPD /tls.conf and then add all of these lines. If they're commented out, you can uncomment them, but this just turns it on. This sets where you want the log file. This sets the protocol. And then these two point to the directory where you just generated, or the files that you just generated using the OpenSSL command. And then TLS required just makes it so that's required. And then you will restart the ProFTP service once you're done with all of that. Let me go through that really quickly. Okay. I assume you guys can see my VM. Okay, so like I said, first you'll want to apt-get install ProFTPD. And then you'll want to allow from the firewall, so allow port 21 and then allow port 20. And then you'll want to configure the profdb/profdbd.conf file, change auth pam. So also one thing to note, when you don't see the configuration, when it's not in the file, then you'll just add it yourself. So I can just add it to the top here, auth pam on. And these are separated by like tabs, but you can use spaces and it'll work as well. And then allow over write auth, or sorry, wait, let me first check if this is here. It probably is. Yeah, so allow overwrite. It's set to on right now, so I'll change it to off. Default root. Default root, this is commented out, so I can just get rid of the comment. And it's configured correctly already. And then use IPv6 is on, so I'm going to change it to off. And then save the file and exit. Oh, sorry. Also, check for anonymous blocks. So this is the only anonymous block in the file, and it's commented out, so I don't need to do anything with this. But if it weren't commented out, you'd either comment or just delete the entire thing. And then save and exit. And then to configure TLS, sudo apt-get install OpenSSL, which I already have installed, obviously, from just earlier ago. And then copy and paste that large command again. Remember, this is a different command from the VSFTPD. So you need to be sudo and enter through all of these fields. And then that will generate the two certificate and key files. So now you'll want to edit the profdb/tls.conf file. As you can see, many of the arguments are already commented out, so I can just uncomment this because this looks correct, this looks correct, this looks correct. Um, this is correct and this is correct. And then what are the last ones? Oh yeah, TLS required should be down here probably. Yeah, it's right here. So now I can uncomment this one as well. If they weren't there, then you would just manually write them yourself. And all of this is necessary for enabling TLS using the OpenSSL certificate that you just generated with that long command. So now I can sudo service profdbd restart and you're done. So those are all of the services that I went through for this presentation. It's possible in the future that we go through some more. Actually, it's definitely likely that we'll go over some more like Apache and Samba. But that's all I have for today. Thank you.